How are you? Good afternoon. It's so nice to see you all. Are you doing okay? I hope you are having a nice afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are so pleased that you can join us today. It's already 2024. It's hard to believe, right? How times fly, particularly in January. So we wanted to take this opportunity to have a great discussion with great guests to talk about some of the current topics. So we would like to welcome you again. This is the conference Global Pathways, Finding Common Ground. This is organized by the Luxich Foundation through their program Luxich Scholars. So in our first round of applause is for the work the foundation has been doing throughout the years. As I was saying, we will have a great discussion today. We are going to discuss these topics that are so interesting with the great audience we have here today. I would like to greet the officials that are joining us today, representatives from public agencies, universities, and civil society members. Today, I'm sure you have read a little about our keynote speaker, Nairi Woods. She's the Dean of the School of Government from Oxford University. And then we will have a panel discussion. That's why we have a few chairs here set up for our experts. First, I would like to invite Isabella Luxich, the General Manager of the Luxich Foundation, to welcome you officially to this seminar. Please, let's welcome her with a round of applause. Good afternoon, everyone. We are so happy that the TSA arrived finally. We are so pleased that you can join us with this first conference, Global Pathways, Finding Common Grounds. First, I would like to thank government officials, members from business associations, universities, and other institutions for being here with us. First, I would like to ask you to look at this picture for a moment. Maybe you don't understand what it is. We can't really see what's represented here. You see some shadows, some lights. We could discuss what each and every one of you see here, and maybe we could come up with some interesting ideas. But if we zoom out and provide some perspective to the picture, now we can see clearly that we're talking about a place. It's a map. We don't know a map of what yet, but we already have more information, so we can have a common ground to talk about it. And if we keep zooming out, now we know where we are. This is a satellite image of the building where we are sitting today. That's what happened when we look at the big picture and start looking at our own bellies. We can have some perspective. As we zoom out, we have a more comprehensive view of Santiago, our region, and the entire country. You can see the geographical differences and the distances we see throughout the different areas of our country. And if we keep moving farther away, you can see Cambridge, Massachusetts. Oh, it didn't work. Is it working now? Oh, we're having some issues. But if we move 6,000 kilometers to the north, we see Massachusetts here, a hub of technological and scientific research. Here, the frontiers of knowledge are moved. We keep moving forward every day in different topics. And if we move farther away, we reach Beijing, another major city where every year we see an increase in investment and advances in research, medical sciences, energy, and other key issues. This is what we've been doing for over 20 years. This is what moves us as Luxich scholars and the Luxich Foundation. We are trying to build bridges between Chile and the world and the other way around. We would like to connect with what's going on in other countries, with development, with the knowledge being created to have a global perspective, and also for other countries to hear about Chile and learn about what we're doing here. In the late 90s, Andrónico Luxich started building these relationships of trusts with one of the most prestigious universities in the world. The idea was to build a relationship based in trust so Chileans could have access to opportunities in these renowned international academic institutions. Throughout the decades, we've been implementing more than 30 programs in the US, the UK, Croatia, China, and Chile with more than 1,800 people. 50% of them are Chileans. And although we know these programs are valuable, we believe that today we need to reinforce the links between us. Because the bridges we see within our society, our Chilean society, are weak now. We need to renew those bridges. We need to renew our trust to move forward together. Today, we are hyper-connected. There's so much information, and that brings us away from each other. Now it's important to understand the ideas, the views of those who are near us. And we need to add some perspective to the current topics. The world is facing issues, and Chile as well. Some countries have been covering these issues. They already have developed a few ideas to tackle those issues. This is why we would like to bring that knowledge closer to our country. And that's what we are doing as a foundation. We would like to understand what's going on around the world and provide tools to contribute to that exchange of ideas and people development. By doing this, we would like to talk about the future of work, automation, the major challenges posed by technologies, the data revolution, the environment, sustainability. These challenges mean that we need to work on mutual trust of citizens, institutions, and in democracy itself. So we need to emphasize in the quality of public services, and that's what brings us here. And to keep bringing Chile closer to the rest of the world, we would like to hear about the experiences in other countries, because we could adapt those best practices and also export our own accomplishments to other countries. We would like to analyze problems with a perspective, looking at the big picture, as I said at the beginning. We see some stagnation today in our political discussion, and that's why we invited some international experts. Throughout the next 2 days, we are going to be teaching two workshops to analyze tools and methods to promote dialogue and finding common ground. We are going to be conducting these workshops with the universities of Harvard and Oxford, using this model that we work with in Luxich Scholars. Our professionals closer to this knowledge without the need to travel. This helps us overcome language barriers and also have more representation of our local ecosystem taking part of these programs. The first course from Harvard will explore negotiation methods to help leaders and provide them with the analytical and communication skills they need for effective conversations. The second workshop has to do with the case methodology that was developed by the Blavatnik School of Government of Oxford University, which was designed for university faculty that would like to use the case method to enrich their teaching and promote dialogue within the classroom. This is part of the Master in Public Policy developed by the Blavatnik School of Government, which is renowned worldwide. It was founded by Nairi Woods. She also created a scholarship and other programs. She's part of various organizations and councils of private companies. She's also an advisor to the Australian government, and she's also part of a forum of the Economic World Forum. She was also an advisor to the Asian Bank, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. She's been supporting international institutions on globalization and governance. She was educated at Auckland University. She also studied at Oxford. Then she taught at Harvard. She was appointed commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire for services to higher education and public policy, and she's also a member of prestigious academies of science. So it is our honor and privilege to have her here with us to share her view of the global challenges we are facing here in our country from a global point of view, comparing with the situations in other countries, so we can look beyond our borders for ways to solve our challenges. Thank you so much again for being here, and I hope this discussion will be enriching for all of you, that it would provide us an opportunity to exchange ideas about Chile and the world. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening. Buenas tardes. Es un gran placer, gran.
It is my pleasure to be here. It's quite an honor to be here joining you.
Terrible Spanish. Thank you, Isabella, and thank you for being here this evening. It is truly a pleasure to be here, and in part to celebrate the extraordinary contribution that the Luksic Foundation are making to a stronger, juster, more empowering Chile. But also to be doing that in a week that they have defined as a public service week, and at a time when the Alta Dirección Pública is also, as I understand it, celebrating a special anniversary. As the Dean of a School of Government, it's a joy to be here amidst such a celebration of public service. This morning began in a beautiful garden in Santiago with a whole group of Luksic scholars. And I sat thinking about the difference it has made for this foundation to support so many brilliant Chileans to go abroad, not just to learn new ideas and make new friends, but to tell the world about Chile and to invite the world to Chile. And the Luksic family have been doing that for the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford and for me personally right from the beginning of the school. And I thank them from my heart. The rest of the world has much to learn from Chile, and I hope the rest of the world can sometimes bring ideas to Chile. Early yesterday morning in a conversation, which was Chatham House rules, so I won't mention which private sector leader asked me this, but he will know who he is. And he said, "So what is polarization anyway? What makes you so sure that polarization is happening?" And tonight's theme is puntos de encuentros. Why is it that we need new puntos? Why is it we need to think about how to bring people together? What is this? What evidence do we have of polarization? So what I'm going to do tonight, in what I hope for you will be brief remarks, is first to ask, well, what are the trends that we can see around the world that give some robust sense to this idea of polarization? And second, what do we do about that? What can this country, what can other countries, what can citizens like each of you do about that? And why does it matter? So let's start with what it is and think about why we might be concerned about 5 trends that are happening not just in Chile, but in every part of the world. And the first trend I want to point to is what I would call the fracturing of shared interest. Our societies, whether democratic or non-democratic, are all based on a premise that a person who wants to work hard will be able to work hard and then watch their children lead better lives than them. How many of you have experienced that? Hands up. You know, you work hard, you hope that your children will lead better lives than you. That belief is collapsing around the world. And of course, the global financial crisis, COVID, the cost of living crisis after the war in Ukraine, these effects have all amplified a longer-term trend where a larger and larger number of households in so many countries across the world no longer believe that in 5 years' time their family will be better off if they work hard. And they're not wrong if we look at the data. There's a number of studies that show us that actually most households are at best staying constant or seeing their household revenue stagnate, but many are actually falling behind. So the first thing I would say is that polarization of this shared belief, this fracturing of this shared interest, is the first thing that we must note. The rising number of people in the world who believe that the system is rigged against them. No matter how hard they work, they're not going to improve their lot or the lot of their children. And that's, I think, the first thing that we have to note. The second is a collapse in shared information. So just at the beginning of this year, the international journal Science has published a study done by 17 independent academics across 12 universities who were given unrivaled access to all Facebook's data on its 208 million American users. And what they wanted to work out was, is it true that people live in echo chambers? And their evidence, sadly, tells us it is amply true, that people are accessing almost exclusively information that is from like-minded people. That the world has moved into a world of these echo chambers. It's a slightly more intense phenomenon in their study in America among conservative thinkers. But it's true of both, right across the political spectrum, that people now live in these echo chambers. And that's important because particularly democracies require their citizens to have some base of shared information, to share the same facts, even though they completely disagree about the interpretation of those facts. And so that's the second trend. I've mentioned the US study in Science, but if you go to the Pew Foundation survey, the Edelman survey published last week, if you go to any of the data that's being collected on this phenomenon, you'll see that every year it's a little more the case that the world is living in those echo chambers. And that is creating a polarization of information and belief. A third trend that we can see around the world is a post-COVID effect, or a post-COVID amplified effect, of people withdrawing from public spaces. So if you think about it, one of the reminders that we are all human beings, that if you're a Republican, Democrats do not have horns and breathe fire. If you're a Democrat, Republicans don't have horns and breathe fire, is when you take your children to school and you realize, wow, they're parents, they have children, and their children are not monsters. Well, they might be monsters, it might not be their fault, your children might be monsters as well. We're all human. Since the end of COVID, in almost every country of the world, fewer children are going to school. The BBC reported this morning that 17% of children are absent from primary schools in the United Kingdom, and 28% of children are absent from secondary schools. in the United Kingdom. UNICEF have just produced a report telling us that across developing countries, across refugee camps, across countries rich and poor, we're seeing fewer children going to school. That's got important consequences, not just for whether your population learn and are literate, but important consequences for the mental health, the anxiety, but also for society and the socialization of society. What we've seen in studies that I'm going to come back to when I come to the solutions to this is how important schools are to keep a society together, to keep a society believing that although they disagree, the other side is not a monster. The other part of the withdrawal is public spaces, the withdrawal of and from public spaces. It's really hard to find evidence and data about this. So it's really, I'm posing to you more of a question about whether you're observing that there are fewer public spaces and fewer people in them. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there from all kinds of different countries about the selling off of public sports grounds, the closing of public parks, the decline of public transport that people take together, of the less accessible public squares, of public buildings that are now closed because of security concerns, of children's playgrounds that are closed because there isn't the funding to maintain them. And those public spaces are incredibly important. Think about the Greek agora. Right from ancient Greece, this sense that if you want to build citizenship, you need a space where citizens can recognize each other as citizens, not as rich, not as poor, not as religious, not as non-religious, but as fellow citizens. And so I think that for me, the third trend is this shrinking of public spaces, of schools, of playgrounds, of places where people are reminded that they are all part of the same endeavor, the same country, the same community. The fourth trend is a narrowing of people's sense of community. So the Edelman Trust Barometer evidence published this week poses to people in 28 countries, some 32,000 people, and they ask these people, would you, in front of somebody who does not share your views, somebody who does not agree with you on most issues, would you help that person if they needed help? Would you be willing to work with that person in the workplace? Would you be willing to live in the same neighborhood as that person? And to me, it's pretty extraordinary. Only 30% of people said they would help somebody in need if they had a different view to them. Only 20% of people said that they wanted to live in a neighborhood where people think differently. Only 20% said that they wanted to work with people who disagree with their views. This is a very different world to a world of 20 years ago. And finally, the fifth trend of this polarization that we talk about is the declining trust in government. And here there are so many measures, from the OECD measure of declining trust in government to the Pew Foundation measure, again the Edelman measure. And this is important. It's not just telling us that we might have lousy politicians or public servants that need to work better. It's telling us something more fundamental, because to rebuild trust in government means rebuilding a sense that it is our government. And for it to be our government, there needs to be a belief that that government is acting on behalf of all of us, that we are a community and that it can act on behalf of all of us. So for me, the reason I put the declining trust in government last is because I think it's both caused and causing the other four trends. So my first answer to the question I was put yesterday morning by a Chilean private sector leader, what is this polarization? Is it really happening? Is yes. We can see these 5 trends around the world. Now, people use polarization to mean all kinds of things. But when I'm using it tonight, I'm saying these 5 dimensions, we can see trend lines that show that societies are separating, fracturing, and no longer sharing an interest, an identity, a willingness to help one another, a willingness to work together, a willingness to live together, and that should concern us if we want to be governed together. So let me now move very briefly to what we can do about this. How can we rebuild? How do we bring a society that's fractured together? And I don't like the word depolarize. I think it's wrong to imagine that because somebody sits on a different part of the spectrum, you should change them and bring them to somewhere in the middle or somewhere on your end of the spectrum. I don't think the problem is about people having different views. The problem is the absence of other things that hold them together. So how do we rebuild this sense of community and shared interest? So let me just run through the 5 things and talk about what seems to work in the places where it's being tried. And the first is to rebuild a shared sense of interest. Society doesn't work unless most people believe that the rules are worth abiding by, unless most people believe that if they work hard in some shared common endeavor, their lives will get better. And we do have to recognize that since the global financial crisis and quantitative easing and monetary policy and the effect that's had on asset prices, wealth inequality has hugely increased around the world. We do have to recognize a longer trend that Thomas Piketty and others pointed out some time ago, that the returns to capital are increasing very rapidly at a time when the returns to labor are going down. And that is unlikely to lead to stability and a shared sense of interest in society. So we have to be innovative about this. We don't have to do some early 20th century revolution. We can think innovatively. What does it mean? If the returns to capital are going up so far, how do we give equity stakes in that to a wider part of the population? How do we give them an interest so that society holds together? The second, on shared information. I think we can't just say, let's, as a philosopher said to me in Britain, we should force everybody to sit down and listen to 1 hour of the BBC every day. I don't think that this is a way forward. But I think one important step that we must take is to marry freedom of information with a responsibility to take responsibility for what you're saying. It's not the first time the world is full of misinformation and people shrieking at one another. During the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, 18th century, pamphleteering was their way of sending a tweet or an X or a Facebook post. And pamphleteering, which was so much part of the English Civil War, it was part of the French Revolution, came about as soon as people could print a pamphlet and print scurrilous lies about people that would inflame populations. There's nothing societies get more excited about than a really juicy lie about somebody. And that's been true for centuries. So how did they deal with that problem when it started causing huge unrest? The censors got together and they said, well, actually, any printing house that's printing a pamphlet, we must require to have the full name and full address of the author of the pamphlet. It doesn't even have to be on the pamphlet, but the printing house name must be on the pamphlet, and the printing house must know the name and full address of the person whose pamphlet they're publishing. To me, social media today isn't so very different. The anonymity and the lack of any responsibility at all for what you say online, more importantly, the lack of any responsibility of those who are not just offering a platform, but who are publishing what's on a platform. Why do I say that? Because they're applying algorithms to that information, and they are therefore sending it to more and more people themselves as the social media company. That is an act of publication, and therefore we should regulate them, just as we do everybody that publishes information. In other words, take responsibility for what you're saying. And that would be a first step towards the sharing, towards creating a less toxic information environment, which is particularly toxic to democracies. The third, on shared spaces and social contact. How do we, when people are no longer putting their kids in school, they either don't have access to public spaces. What do we do about that? Well, the first thing we have to do is understand how important it is. Let me give you one little story. In the north of the United Kingdom, in a place called Oldham, there were race riots over a decade ago, 2 decades ago. And the race riots were between the one community, which was predominantly white, working class English community, and a South Asian community of immigrants, predominantly immigrants from Pakistan and Bangladesh. And the race riots were young people from either side, from these two communities, in a war with each other. Quite accidentally, the government at the time was trying to reduce education expenditure and decided to close one of the schools and open instead a school that would serve the whole community. They had no social purpose. It was actually a financial decision. Instead of paying for 2 schools, let's pay for 1. And a social psychologist at Oxford, Professor Miles Hewson, said, "Oh, this is a fantastic experiment. Let's study what happens. We've got a completely divided community who are literally trying to kill each other and who have separate schools, and now they're going to build one school which serves both communities." And so they sent in researchers, and the researchers pretended to be lunch monitors. And they went in every day, and what they did was they took note of where children sat and who they sat with at lunch. So in the beginning, the white children all sat together, and the South Asian children all sat together. There was no mixing. And they didn't do anything proactive, but as the year unfolded, the children started mixing. And so they charted, by charting these school lunches, what happened as the children spontaneously began to mix around and start sitting with each other for lunch. And they backed it up by asking themselves, when the children started mixing, did their parents start talking to one another? Did the parents start showing less antagonism towards each other? And they found that they did. And that experiment, to me, is a really important one for us all to think about. We live in countries where schools are segregating. They're segregating rich and poor, they're segregating different religious groups, different ethnicities, different races. And we must understand that we're losing a huge opportunity for cohesion when we fragment. And the Oldham example, I think, is an important one. Some countries, Singapore, in their public housing, took this evidence, not just this evidence, there is quite a lot of evidence about this, so seriously that in their public housing, I'm told, they very deliberately put families of different ethnicities, carefully arranged according to their proportion in the population in their public housing, to ensure that they're not creating ghettos of different divided communities. So we need to think about that. What are our shared spaces? Where is it that our fellow citizens get to mingle with us? Not as a cleaner or a waiter, not as somebody who is either the employer or the employed, not as somebody who is senior or junior, but simply as citizens. And that's what walking in a public park means. Or to quote the former mayor of Medellin, who transformed Medellin from the murder capital of Central and Latin America to one of the most peaceful cities on the continent. And they created huge public spaces, parkways, cable cars going up to the poorer housing areas, places where citizens could move around together and recognize that they were, in the end, citizens, whatever their other identities. So the fourth thing I talked about was the narrowing of community, people feeling a sense of community with a smaller and smaller group, just people that look like them, pray like them, eat like them, go to the same schools as them. And the evidence here is positive. It's that what brings people together are very local, very practical projects. The evidence of communities that come together to protect a playground, or to protect a park, or to argue for clean air. One of the few issues that brings the very wealthy and the very poor in a certain part of London together is the fact that none of them want their children to be continuing to get asthma from the poor air quality. And there's a study the OECD have done on climate action, which tells us that when you have in front of you somebody who has a totally different ideology to you, different theoretical beliefs, a different interpretation of the facts, probably the worst thing you can do is tell them they're wrong, their facts are wrong, and their ideology is wrong, and try to persuade them that yours is right. That's a bummer, because academics spend their whole lives doing that, so, you know. But it is a mistaken action. What they do find works positively is not to trifle with the theories and the interpretations and the ideologies, but rather to propose to people very concrete, practical projects that aim towards a goal that both of them share. And then they can start cooperating, then they can achieve a modicum of trust, then they can begin to realize that somebody can have a totally different view but still be a human being. And finally, let me end with rebuilding trust in government. This one is hard. All around the world, I hear people saying, these stupid people, they don't understand how much the government does for them, without listening enough to why people have lost their trust in government. In the summer, I read the novel Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. It takes you into the life of a community who turned to their doctors about 15 years ago when they had a sore leg, a sore hip, a sore back from their work. And their doctors prescribed them a magic pill with no side effects called OxyContin. And when they took the pill home, their neighbors said, do not take it. Don't trust the doctor. It'll kill you. Look at what's happening in our community. And when that person went back to the doctor and said, are you sure there's no side effects? The doctor said, no, listen, I'm a doctor, I know. And the FDA, the government regulator, says it's safe. And one of America's most notable pharmaceutical companies is making this pill. Of course it's safe. All that expertise versus your neighbor. What does your neighbor know? Those communities watched their communities die from the incredibly addictive qualities of the drugs that they were being prescribed. I mention that story because some 15 years later, many people in those communities said, I don't want a COVID vaccination because I don't trust it. And they were told, what do you mean you don't trust it? I'm your doctor. I'm telling you it's safe. The FDA have tested it, and the FDA says it's safe. And one of this country's largest, most eminent pharmaceutical companies is making this vaccination. So why on earth are you skeptical? And I think we need to pause before we say they're stupid for not believing all that, don't we? We have to stop and understand why people themselves are not have lost their trust in government, and then think about how we rebuild it. Now, I think we can rebuild it, and we've got to go to the heart of those communities to rebuild it. We have to go to the people who are trusted by their communities, and it's no longer central government. And it's more and more people in those local communities. And the positive story I can tell you is that the world has now done some 700 plus experiments in different ways to deliberate, in different ways to engage local communities. I know you've had some experience here in Chile. I haven't heard many positive reactions to the consultations around constitutional reform, and we're going to talk more about that tonight. But there are experiments which have had some pretty extraordinary effects. In Ireland, when they created a public deliberation body of some 100 randomly selected Irish people, and they spent 6 years deliberating on 5 of the most controversial issues in Ireland, talking to those people, talking to the communities that those people were from. You keep hearing the same story, which is, for example, as an elderly man said to me, I still don't believe that abortion's right, but when I sat listening to those stories of those people, I had to understand that they were living through great pain. So he disagreed, but he now had some empathy. And I think we've got to think about the experiments around the world that rebuild that sense of empathy and rebuild that sense of community. I'm going to finish with a question people have been asking me in my last 2 days in Chile, which is, what about referendums? What about going to the people? If they've lost trust in government, engage them through a referendum. And I think that's an understandable response, because people themselves are saying, we want to take back control, give us a voice. And a referendum instinctively looks like a way to do that. But we should be cautious here. The recent referendum in Australia, the Uluru, or Voice referendum, aimed at opening a possible space for more voice for Indigenous people, but without defining what that might look like in order to create a process further to consider it, led to an explosion of social media debate, which became more and more extreme and divided Australia in a way that I think it's going to be quite difficult to piece people back together. I think of the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom, which took a population that were suffering in many parts of the United Kingdom from the aftermath of the global financial crisis and some of the difficulties that I've mentioned already tonight, and said to them, do you want to continue with the status quo, or do you want to smash it? Well, we shouldn't be surprised when they said, let's smash it. It's not working for me. But it divided the country. It divided the country horribly and increased the distrust. So for me, if you want to use a referendum, the thought I want to leave you with is a checklist of 4 questions, which first you need to answer before you use a referendum. And the first is, why are politicians putting this issue to the population? Because if it's because it's politically tricky for them, if it's because they don't want to risk the wrath of their own political partners, if it's because they worry that they'll be putting their own head on the block if they make this decision and they would rather avoid it by remitting it to the people, you know that this should never be a referendum, because that's a politician trying to avoid responsibility. And the reason that shouldn't happen is the whole point of democracy is that it's politicians who make decisions and then the rest of us can vote them out if we don't like that. If the politician says, I'm letting the people make the decision, you can't vote the people out, can you? So question 1 is, why are politicians putting the question to you? It could be for good reason, and it could be to avoid taking responsibility. And if it's the latter, stop the referendum. The second question is, how have people been prepared for this referendum? In the middle of Brexit, I had the president of Switzerland come to the Blavatnik School at Oxford to explain to us how they use referendums in Switzerland. And he explained the 6-year process of preparing people for a referendum. The culture in Switzerland, where if you even want to put one swing or slide in your local playground, first you have to organize a local consultation. It's a culture of continual consultation. Or the Irish Citizens' Assembly, which met for some 6 years before they had a referendum on the issue of abortion. All of that deliberation took place. So my second question is it a referendum or is it an ambush? Is it being sprung on the people, or is there a proper preparation of people so that they can really understand what's at stake and understand what their fellow citizens, importantly, think about it and are going to be affected by it? My third question is, where is the information about this referendum going to come from? Is it just going to be a social media war, which becomes more and more polarizing and more extreme? Because like it or not, most human beings' eyes, even if they don't like extreme messages, shift to the extreme messages first. And psychologists tell us those are the sticky messages. So before we have a referendum, we really do have to think, what are the communication channels? Which is why these long periods of preparation and consultation are so important. And my fourth question is, who's going to take responsibility for the result? So in Switzerland, when they had a very important referendum, which was on immigration, the Swiss government, which a huge majority voted for the proposal, but the Swiss government said, well, it's us that have to take responsibility. And if we do what the people tell us, we have to rupture our relationship with the European Union, which will have catastrophic consequences for Switzerland. And so they treated the referendum as advisory and promised the people more chances to have a voice on other issues. Now you can say, well, that's a government ignoring the people. No, you could say that, but let me say to you, that's a government taking responsibility for taking a decision. That's a government that's saying to the people, well, you've told us this, we're doing this, and you can vote us out at the next election if you don't like what we're doing. So referendums, alas, are not the magic bullet to rebuilding trust in government, but I hope tonight to have given you 5 different areas in which we have to start rebuilding a sense of shared interest, a sense of shared community, a place to share information, public spaces where people meet, and alongside all of that, the process of rebuilding trust in government. Polarization is happening in different parts of the world, and it will lead to a governability crisis. And it will lead to a governability crisis first and foremost in democracies. And you've seen a little hint of that in Chile already. And that's why I think we have to start taking action in all 5 domains. Thank you very much. I look forward to hearing from the much wiser Chileans.
Súper interesante la presentación de Nairi, entre otras cosas por las preguntas que deja planteadas al final, ¿no? Que me imagino resonaron también en cada uno de nosotros. Vemos reflejado también nuestro propio proceso, los últimos años políticos que hemos vivido en Chile y que hablar además de la última década. Pero súper interesante cómo ella plantea estas preguntas y las deja establecidas y va a ser también parte del panel de conversación. Y digo que es interesante porque si bien la bajada de nuestro seminario es buscando puntos de encuentro, básicamente aquí lo que queremos es generar una discusión y aportar un poco más de reflexión.
Common ground, the idea is to have some reflection and provide some content to enrich the discussion. That's what Nairi was saying. The idea is to help citizens get ready as well. And for me as a journalist, that makes a lot of sense because that's the problem we had in the constituent processes we experience in our countries. Are we ready for this? Are we prepared? Who is in charge of solving these issues? These are part of the questions we ask ourselves and are going to be part of this panel discussion. We would like to thank Nairi again, but now I'd like to introduce all of our guests, the former Undersecretary of Public Health, Paula Daza, who will be joining us this evening. They will not come out individually. I would like to tell you that. But of course, you can give them an applause anyway. We are getting them ready to join the panel. They're getting their microphones, etc. So we had a meeting earlier, the panel members, and so Nairi was asking Dr. Das about the experience during the pandemic and how the public policy was built. And of course, the lessons learned can be applied to other topics other than health. We will be joined by Oscar Landerreche as well, an economist, former chair of Codelco's board. We will be joined by the professor from the Universidad de Chile, Verónica Figueroa, associate professor of the Institute of Public Affairs and former Luxich scholar, and also the Chilean lawyer Sebastián Soto. Let's give them all a round of applause. So we will be talking, we will have this discussion here in our panel with Nairi as well. As I was saying, the idea is for the conversation to open the path for some discussions. Maybe we will find some common grounds, maybe not. Maybe that's not our final goal, because the conversation doesn't end here. We're just getting started. So we would like to hear all of our panel members. Paula is joining us, Oscar, as I said, Veronica, Sebastián, and Nairi. So now we are ready. Let's give them a round of applause.
How are you? Thank you so much for being with us. I was commenting that we had met beforehand, and I think it's very relevant, so we get to know each other and we get to meet each other and know ourselves from the different roles. So we have a very good conversation prepared for you. Before beginning the panel, I would like to thank everyone who are connected through streaming, and we know that they provide content and they ask questions and they also nurture this conversation. I will begin with you, Paula, and the first question is for all the panel members. We're doing the Spanish, this in Spanish, but Nairi has her receiver. So before, we were talking with Oscar what's happening in Ecuador, for example, with various crises. Nairi mentioned it very well. Sometimes we think that this is an internal process, but they are global processes, actually. So there's a very important question. Do you think that it's necessary to reach consensus, and why? First of all, I would like to thank the Luxich Foundation for having the opportunity to be in this conversation, which is very relevant. I get so emotional and so excited to see this panel and all the people here. Maybe a few years ago, we would be sitting here, but this would be empty. So to see this auditorium with so many people really is fascinating. And to see your faces without a mask, and these things are really make me happy. First of all, I will talk to you from the health point of view, because I have dedicated my life to health. And from that point of view, and in my experience, I think, we are here from different worlds with different outlooks. And that's why the first thing that I would like to say is that we do have common objectives. And in that context, I think one of the common objectives is that we care about Chile, and we are concerned about contributing to our country, and thirdly, to find the best solutions for our country. Therefore, I think that when you have clear objectives and common objectives, probably we will be able to reach some consensus. And within that context, I think that, yes, we can advance in the different contexts, advance in consensus. And I think there are various experiences here. I will speak from the health point of view, and I would put the pandemic as an example, because I think the pandemic taught us very much in that sense. We have to, retake what we learned in the pandemic. The pandemic arrived in a situation of crisis. We came from the social unrest of October 18. We had a very disturbed country in a very complex situation. And I was on the side of the government, so there was distrust. And what Nairis just spoke about, the issue of trust, is so relevant. And in that context of lack of trust and social unrest, we had to take very difficult measures, make these difficult decisions in a world of uncertainty. And we had to create consensus. And the first thing that was fundamental, and that's why in relation to your question, is to say that all players have to participate. The state, the government, local government, the private sector had a critical role, the civil society, and the academic world. Each one of them contributing from their side, an outlook from their opportunities and from their richness or wealth to a country that had a common objective, that it was to face the hardest pandemic in the last 100 years. And in that context, obviously, first of all, we had to say that we needed evidence, and to the extent that we contribute to the country from the scientific world and with difficult, maybe, measures to reach consensus. And when Nairi talked about vaccination, I think that despite the different views, maybe different outlooks, we reached consensus that we had to advance in those public policies that where we would have the possibility of contributing to our country, putting the people at the center of all this. So despite the different views that we have, each one of us, from our own point of view, and diversity is legitimate, I think there are different opportunities. And I would like to close this with something that's very important. We are currently in Chile in a very complex sanitary condition because the health institutions are going through a crisis. So there is a health committee was formed for health reforms where we see people from different outlooks, political, academic, social views, where we said from the very beginning, what are those proposals where we agree on? And then let's advance on those proposals where we agree. Obviously, there are some where we don't agree. So let's put those limits in order to advance. And in relation to your question, I think that, yes, we can reach a consensus. We will probably have a different view, but always thinking with this objective in mind to provide solutions to the problems that we all face. Taking the point that Oscar says, that Paula says, in relation that we need consensus and to achieve the best outcome for our country. And that's in the best interest of all the parties. But how much do you give up from our own views, our own belief? So is first of all, then first is consensus important, and how much do you give up from your own private personal views? First of all, thank you for being here with this marvelous panel. First, I think that when it's possible to build consensus, not understood as unanimity, but that would be too demanding. But when you can build a style of consensus, obviously we have to try. It's very useful when you have emergency system like a war economy or pandemic economy. I think they lend themselves to that kind of possibility. It's not always achieved. But I think that for the problems that we are facing in our society, in our culture, in our economy and politics, I think to have this target of reaching consensus, because I hear this a lot from a lot of people and from another era also. I think that it's leaving the bar too high, and I think it's destined to fail. I think the word consensus, it's ideally, if it's possible, let's do it. But I prefer the word agreement or transaction. In any case, this is in the roots of the liberal democracy. If we go to the English democratic life, it gets finally to a progressive amount of civil wars like 1,000 years back. When the English, when they resolved them, they ended up, they just hit themselves with axes and spades, and they finally served a contract. They called it the Magna Carta, and then they made many of these, and that ended up with the Constitution of the United States with that same background. But we will never, ever reach consensus, but we can reach an agreement, a transaction, like a contract, and that to the extent that societies have become more complex. This has become more evident that you need a contract because the complex societies are a gathering of contradictory points of view. And I think we have underestimated the complexity of the society and the economy where we live. Here we have people from all ages. I can see some of you that have received a scholarship. They're too young to make, but there are some veterans here among the crowd. And we can remember, if you remember, can remember the society where we lived. When you were 20 years old, everything was simpler in relation of less categories that had to negotiate between them. It was easier to order this. And the speed of technological change and of all kinds that has led us to be in a society with a level of complexity that we still don't manage to deal with it. And many of that experimentation, institutional or democratic, as Professor Woods mentioned, is that many countries have felt that, and they're trying to see how they can set a new contract, a new operation that will take on this complex structure. And of course, yes, to build consensus, but mostly all of them to build just basically agreements, transactions, solutions where we can all feel a part of. Yes, the adjustment has been very complex. Veronica, we would also like to know your point of view in terms of these two questions. First of all, yes, I would like to thank the invitation to come and have this dialogue and put on the table some issues that are important, like how do we reach some agreements in the diversity, but in also the inequities that our country has that have been expressed in recent times and very strongly. And I think Naire mentioned some issues that are key. And in this case, I'm going to be in my role as academic, but also with my identity as a Mapuche woman, because as Mapuche, we can also dream. And I think that's the key on how we can think about what we want. If you think about the problems that we had to face, it's difficult to reach an agreement and to do a diagnosis of what are the problems and what are the urgencies, because we are facing imminent situations that are like a threat to all living beings, like climate change, and how climate change also requires our responsibility as citizens, but also it requires knowledge that is different. And many times we haven't been able to put the knowledge in a context of equality. But maybe more than thinking about the problems, to think of what we dream of. When you ask the students, the diverse students that we have in Universidad de Chile, what do you dream about? And their attitude and what they project is different. There is a possibility to be able to share what is it, what they dream of in the short and medium term, and this intergenerational responsibility that Naire mentioned, and what we aspire for, not only for our children, but for all living beings, and obviously for the people in society. And the fact of dreaming about this and to be able to talk about dreams also requires that we all have the possibility of putting our voices in equal terms in the spaces for debate. And that's difficult for some people that some groups that have been historical, displaced, and excluded, where we haven't been able to put all of these issues with the sufficient capacity of reflection or to look where is that common ground. And that's why in this area of exponential changes, these are changes that not only in the dimension, but also in the speed with which they happen. And to talk about when those points of convergence or common grounds, we haven't been able to live it in our neighborhoods, in educational facilities, or in the primary, secondary, and tertiary school, and because it still shows high levels of segregation. So I think there's a very important challenge there, and the limitations that we've had, especially in the constitutional processes, where many of us dreamed about putting those topics in the spaces with a constitution that is not always prepared for that equality, and putting those voices, as I said. And also thinking about time. I see this with my students that are there with their cell phones permanently on with them, and our cell phones are updated all the time, and you can see that you have maybe 5, 6 updates on the smartphones. And there's not everyone works the same way, so there's not one single key where we could do this as fast, because we see these changes that are exponentially big and fast. So I think the space for dialogue is great. It's like a window of opportunity to be able to talk, maybe in another scenario with frustrations, because you also have to put this on the table, but also with dreaming about that society that we want. As we were saying, there is a huge opportunity from the institutions of where we are, because the universities are still those entities that generate more trust, but also that thought is still encrypted and coded only for those who have the possibility of accessing that knowledge. It's still knowledge based on competition and not in dialogue and conversation. And to democratize the knowledge and to bring in the issues of society to these spaces, so there's a two-way street. And that scenario is complex. So I think, just to close, I think that we have important challenges that we might think about the dreams that we have, and also how we can generate a space for dialogue that is symmetrical, without exclusions, without leaving topics aside, because there are topics that we must address today, especially what is the institutionality that we want for this common ground. And also, in terms of frustration, also said on what moves us, and the passion that moves us, and the dreams that move us, and put that at the center of our work.
That's an important message, right? That we need to consider these dreams and passion. So based on what Veronica was saying, I would like to ask you, Sebastián, how we can bring these ideas to the academia, to the public sector, to different sectors, in order to find agreement, consensus, or what we are looking for. Thank you so much, Soledad, and thank you for the invitation. It's my honor to be part of this panel with these guests. So thank you to the Luxich Foundation as well. So thinking about your questions, Soledad, I would like to start talking about the political discussion, because consensus in the political discussion has been losing strength. And that's because apparently there's another idea that's gaining traction, which is that that confrontation produces better results in the elections. That is to say, that is not here in Chile, it's around the world. Being confrontational helps you win elections. That's what we've seen. So, and what we experience in our constituent process allows us to maybe ask a few questions about that. Maybe we can discuss us further. But our main challenge for the future when it comes to a consensus or finding common ground in politics, we need to strengthen a governance, because we need to consider that confrontation is not enough to provide enough governance. And I think the challenge for democracies is governance in the future. To answer to the challenges you were talking about, healthcare, cohesion, etc. So that's why I think consensus, giving up confrontation, reaching agreements, whether they're explicit or not, about what we can do and what we cannot do, what's fair and unfair, what's decent or not in politics, is key. And I would like to comment on something Oscar said, because I think we need to talk about different levels. Consensus is key. We are talking about the basic elements. And we need to agree on how we talk about it as well. Yeah, transactions are important, of course, but you build transactions and agreements on basic consensus. In societies as diverse as ours, we have minimum consensus or common ideas, but those are the basis for our transactions and agreements. And so what can we do as in the institutional framework to produce the integration we need? I think there are many different possible answers. First, we need the politics and the academia to be part of the discussion with the communities, and we need to delve deep into that. And I think this is a particular challenge for the academia to persuade politics, and you said that yourself, Nairi, we need to persuade politics that the governance, that this basic consensus are key. So you say we need a common ground, right? And we're talking about legitimacy, those things that we cannot compromise on, the basis. Of course, we won't have unanimity, but we can have some basic values that we need to share in time. And based on that, we can do the transactions and reach agreements. That sounds good. Yeah, let's hail transactions. Yeah, maybe that doesn't sound so good, but I think it's needed. And just to wrap up the idea, the experience I have as a member of the Expert Advisory Commission for the constituent process, we had some basic consensus that were not said. And I think the main one was not repeating the previous experience. That was our consensus, but we didn't need to say it, but it was clear. And based on that, we had so many transactions, infinite transactions. I ended up voting in favor on some regulations that I'm against. But that's what you do in order to reach agreements, of course. So, Nairi, what are your thoughts on the questions we've been asking here, and what you've been hearing about, and what you know about our panel members?
Yeah.
Is that we don't need to agree, we need to agree to disagree.
Yeah.
And that's an important difference. You know, democracy is not about homogenizing the whole of society. I don't think any of us would want that. The three foundations of liberal democracy, elections, the rule of law, the protection of minorities, are all about accommodating difference. And I think that's what my fellow panelists are talking about. Like, so we need a consensus, as you put it, Sebastian, on the most basic things, which are agreement about those three things. We need agreement that we will abide by the election result, that we will abide by the rule of law, that we will protect minorities. But after that, we should be agreeing to disagree. And that's what I think we're having this discussion because it's become extremely difficult to disagree. Or I should say, it's become difficult to agree to disagree. We see this in all our universities, that across the world, instead of arguments, we're seeing identities. We're seeing people saying, you can't say that because you're a woman. Or you can't say that because, you're black, or you're white, or you're religious, or you're from this country, or you're from that country. And in the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford, I've got two colleagues here, Emily Jones and Karthik Romano, who spend their lives teaching students how to disagree, how to have conversations across these enormous divides. Instead of saying, I'm simply not talking to you because you have an identity that I do not speak to, teaching those students to be curious, to say, tell me about why you have such a completely different view to me. And I think as universities, every one of us has to be engaged in that. And we have to help every generation learn to do that. And social media is making that difficult because social media groups people by identity. And so if you're a stamp collecting Star Wars enthusiast who's Catholic and, white and lives in this community, you can only mix with people like that. You can choose only to mix with people like that. And then anyone who's outside of that group you don't want to speak to. That's what social media is doing for us. And that's why, as educators, we can and we should exercise all our powers to teach each generation this agreement to disagree. Right.
Yeah. Pasemos rápido por un poquito más breve, ¿les parece? Por en la siguiente.
Let's go a little faster, maybe with brief answers, so we can cover a third question. Because I think it's also interesting to ask you a straightforward question. Is democracy at risk? When talking about polarization, what we've seen in our country, we talked about that before. That's why we signed an agreement. But in your opinion, Oscar, is democracy at stake here? Yes. I confirm that. Yeah, I do believe that. I think history has showed us the brief history of liberal democracy, because this is basically new. We have the liberal democracy in a few places, and it's new. And we've seen that there's the temptation in our elites, in the countries that have, where where democracy has been at risk, there's been an impulse to try to avoid that, to not believe what reality is showing you directly. And I think that temptation, that denial, it's that need to protect yourself when you are afraid of seeing structures around you collapse. And that sometimes that prevents us from seeing reality. I've seen this before. I've said this on media, so I don't think this is shocking for the audience here. But I still work at the School of Economy of the Universidad de Chile, and I'm there on the 15th floor, and I still see the remains of 3 churches that were burned during the social unrest of 2019. I see the ruins. One is called San Francisco, the other one is Asunción, and the third one is the Church of Veracruz. I'm not a Catholic. I'm not a believer at all, but I see those. And I've read history, and I've seen places where religious temples have been burned, and I know where that leads us. I see that I have your full attention now. Yes, our audience is awake. What I'm trying to say, that if you want to see the threat to democracy, if you want to pretend that those churches were not burned, we can continue to live like that. But we actually can't. Well, that's why I'm saying we need to face that, to think about the crudeness of what we've experienced. We've been talking about what happened in Ecuador, the political situation in Argentina, the situation in Peru, Bolivia. let's see things for what they are. We've seen these things happen in our democracies in Latin America. And after 15 or 20 years, we were saying, oh, we are all living under dictatorships. I wonder how it happened. So that's behind. But I do believe that those of us who believe in democracy need to work hard to reform our democracy, update it, to include more people, to make it more functional, to take on more responsibility about how things work. Otherwise, we might lose that. Veronica, is democracy at risk? Well, I live near that area Oscar is talking about, so I see that every day as well. I do believe there's a risk, and it's a risk we need to consider and talk about. But of course, when we look at the big picture, the global picture, when we ask ourselves why countries fail, why democracies fail, this has to do with the distrust in our institutions. That's key. And it's been a while since various international organizations have been saying that here in Chile there's this distrust in our elites, in the institutions, that the people don't feel represented by those in power. And that lack of trust is worse. And these constituent processes we experience also showed us that there's some institutional frameworks we need to change. We haven't agreed on which ones or how, but the path is already open. And I think we have a responsibility there as well, because universities and higher education institutions can't look away, because we are the ones training those elites, the ones that are in government or the private sectors, the ones that are leading also the third sector. So we need to ask ourselves what we are teaching them, what we are telling them about the institutional framework, citizenship, how to live in a community, how we're thinking about those problems. And there are some concepts that we took for granted, like democracy itself, the meaning of a representative democracy, when we have indigenous peoples, when we have women, when we have other sectors that this liberal democracy have now allowed to express or be part of the political design, that are not represented, that are not part of the institutional framework. When we think about our bureaucracy, that also transpires into our public policy. So I think there's a lot we need to reflect on, and we need to take on that responsibility. And maybe that's why we need to put some topics on the table for them to be discussed. Paula? Well, I think that without a doubt, democracy in our country has been at risk and is still at risk. Now, understanding why, and I think many of us want to understand how we got here after going through a process where we had a dictatorship and a disruption to our democracy. And I think there are some key elements. So first, I think that Chile has become a society that's quite fragmented. And human beings enjoy sharing with others when they feel trust. So I think that the loss of trust we've seen, the lack of trust between different groups, public institutions, people don't trust in their institutions, in the institutional framework, they don't trust in politics. And there's no trust in other institutions that in some way were in charge of providing us that sustainability. And when you lose that trust, when you don't trust those who are in charge of governing a country, of providing the guidelines, then of course you see this fragmentation within the country. That has to do with the territory itself, with ideologies, and it's also related to what Sebastián said. This fragmentation in our country has been good for various groups, and probably those extremes, whether they are political, ideological, or others, that's been positive for certain groups. They had gains based on that, but that will impact democracy and put it at risk. So I think we need to be very careful. I think that many times we don't really consider how far we can go, how disruptive our democracy could become. This was part of the constituent process of, well, I don't like talking about myself, but I experienced it during the pandemic. I experienced some very hard situations. I see Raúl Figueroa here, that was in charge of the Ministry of Education, and he went through a very difficult process. We were trying to bring children back to schools. We wanted them to go back to school in person, because here in Chile, schools don't only provide education, they also get food. It's a place where children are protected. And in spite of that, Raúl faced a process in Congress because he was in favor of children going back to school. So I think those situations we live show us the fragmentations we experience today in our society, and probably we need a better assessment of the current situation and how to face it. And I think there are different ways to do that, but I also believe that we need to move forward with those with the policies and working with the leaders that can provide sustainability to a country, because the risk is that we lose our democracy. So I think that every players, all the stakeholders involved here, from the academia, civil society, everyone here, the private sector as well, the media, they all have a role to play. The media inform people. So I think it's our responsibility not just to build that trust, but also to inform and educate our citizens so we don't lose our democracy again.
I would like to answer the question about democracy from two perspectives. First, from the Chilean point of view. For a few decades, we have a very big consensus on democracy. The consensus in Chile are abandoned very quickly. Let's just think about the consensus about the prescription of violence, political violence, that we thought we had it completely tied up to our DNA. And at one moment, that consensus started shaking, and shaking greatly. I think one of the most critical aspects of the convention was like winking all the time to violence. And the view, the horizon of the 18th floor or 15th floor in La Fen, well, before it was in the Araucanía, where churches were burned regularly. So I think our consensus, they shake very rapidly in Chile. And in terms of legitimacy of democracy, the sources of legitimacy tend to be the tradition, the formality, the law, and they tie up their legitimacy in form. And this is not a novelty, but that is changing, because today legitimacy possibly lives more in the effectiveness of the governments than in their ways and their tradition or the charisma of the leader. And I close this as an example. This is an example that I took from a recent book of Samuel Sakharov from an NYU professor. And it says that the Terminal 3 of the Beijing airport took 4 years in being built. In London, Terminal 5 took 20 years in being built. So where is the efficacy, the legitimacy given by the Western democracy versus the challenge posed by a country that is not democratic, but that achieves that more earlier effective response. I think that is a very important note. Well, we have committed with our audience, so I will close the panel, but I want to close this with you, Naida. So if you can answer the last question that we had for everyone, but it has been answered already. What is the role of the academy? And if in the educational processes we can get to reach consensus or agreements?
So I'm still not sure that our goal is to reach consensus, but
Okay.
maybe this is just
Yeah.
semantic. I think the most important thing we need to understand if we're thinking about democracy is that it is a system to accommodate difference. And that's important. People are tired around the world. We've heard it. People describe democracy as messy, unstrategic, short-termist, or at worst, a procession of politicians, each taking turns to raid the state. So who would want that system? Well, what I would say is before you jump to that conclusion, take a look at the World Bank's list of countries in order of wealth and look at the top 30 or 40 countries. Almost all of them are democracies. And take a look at the bottom 30 or 40 countries. Almost all of them are authoritarian. Almost all. And if you go back to the top and you think about countries that are growing fast, I have great respect for the proficiency of policy in many of those countries. But they do have a tendency to intolerance. And I do think that that's why democracy is worth us fighting for. Because we live in very diverse societies. And diversity, if well managed, can have a magic that no homogenization can achieve. And I think that's what we've got to be teaching in our academies. We've got to model it by having a full diversity in our classrooms. And then it's not enough just to have a tokenistic bunch of different, people. You've then got to think about how you really work that, whether it's a boardroom or a company or your own organization. It's not enough just to have the diversity. It's then how do we really make that your magic? How do you make that help you be the highest performing people, the highest performing organizations in the world? That's what I think we can do in the Academy.
Thank you so much. Nairi, Sebastián, Verónica, Paula, Oscar, muchísimas gracias por sus reflexiones.
Thank you very much to all of you, panel members, for your conversation. Big round of applause for them. Some important points just to close through hashtag Caminos Globales. We join a conversation. I would like to thank everyone who were hearing this conversation through streaming. And if you want to look for more information, the meeting is in Caminos Globales. I think what we have heard in this opportunity is very interesting. They're all different points. And as I said, we just wanted to reflect on this. I guess you all want to share. You also want to make all of these ideas concrete, and all of this will happen in the patio of these sculptures. There's a sculptures yard or patio or square that is beautiful where we can share a cocktail with you and a very good conversation. So I end up thanking the Lux H Foundation for asking me to be part of this panel, and as the communication media, we also have a very important responsibility. Thank you very much.